Leah, it's really wonderful to be together
It is so
on
great.
this broadcast. I remember when your book came out, Young Lions, how Jewish authors reinvented the war novel, and how we shared experiences based in part on my book, jMUSE. Do you want to say just a little bit about how you decided to work on this, and how you what you found? Yeah.
Yeah, it's so great to be here. And honestly, I could never have written Young Lions without GI Jew, because you laid all the groundwork that I was able to sort of jump off of when I wrote this. So when I wrote Young Lions, I wrote it because I wanted to write a book about popular Jewish novels, because we all knew about Roth and Bellow, but I wanted to see who else people were reading. And I decided to mine the best-selling list of the New York Times, and I discovered the shocking thing that in 1948, there were 6 novels by and about Jewish soldiers in World War II that were all over the top of the best-selling list. So I thought, that's very strange and certainly worthy of investigation. So what I ended up discovering when I wrote Young Lions was that, except for a few cases, the vast majority of best-selling writing in the United States was by Jews and about the Jewish soldier in World War II. Mm-hmm. And I was really intrigued about what that meant and why these books were so popular and how these guys rewrote sort of the war experience from a Jewish angle. And so to write the book, what I did was I wanted to, talk not only about the books themselves, but the authors. So I wrote sort of, how did Norman Mailer serve in the war? Where was he at? What did his letters say? And then I talked about the books themselves and why they were bestsellers, and really focused on the idea that these Jewish mostly male, but a couple of women, reinvented the idea of the soldier and the American soldier in World War II. And something that they were saying really appealed to the American public to make them the best-selling writers in the 40s and the 50s and in the 60s. And I'm sure we'll talk more about it. But one thing that I focused on was this idea that somehow being a Jew made one allowed to talk about the deeper, darker stuff of World War II, because, Jews sort of, because of anti-Semitism, Jewish men were considered sort of weak and sentimental and intellectual and emotional. And somehow the writers use this to talk about the darker side of war. So like a mainstream reader could say about maybe his grandfather in Ohio, wow, he served in World War II and he never talked about this stuff. But a Jewish guy can talk about this stuff, because Jews are supposed to have this sort of internal sensitivity. So that's what the book was about. And the other thing that I wrote about a lot, and it's carried forth in my recent work too, was this sense that when we talked about World War II, we didn't talk enough about the Holocaust, and that the shadow of the Holocaust was so insistent in all of these works, that the other thing I argued was that Jewish American writers taught the American public not to sort of bifurcate, this is World War II and this is the Holocaust, but they made sure all of their novels talked about the Holocaust on the same landscape and space that World War II was unfolding. And I really felt strongly when I wrote the book that they taught the American public that these weren't two separate events, that they were much closer than we think about. So that's...
the point about the Holocaust and World War II being separate events, I mean, that really was where I began, because I began working on jMUSE in 1995 at the 50th anniversary of World War II. And I was struck that, on the one hand, there are these celebrations about the victory over Nazism, of which all American soldiers participated. On the other hand, there's the Holocaust. And the death of millions of Jews, right, in the war. And I didn't see how they came together. And I also didn't see what was the experience, in my case, very personally, of my father, who fought in the war, and he wasn't the only one. All of his buddies fought in the war, right? And I realized that Jewish experience of being a fighter was not present in the ways in which we were remembering in the 90s, World War II and the Holocaust. And it was like a missing link And so that's what sort of propelled me into working on what became jIJUSE. I mean, I started with my father and his buddies, a group of guys from Brooklyn who had a social and athletic club called the Dragons, and they all went into the military. And they served in all these different branches. And in some ways, they were representative of the Jewish experience. And what I discovered, of course, as you know, is that it was a different experience because of anti-Semitism, and because Jews brought their own perceptions and upbringing into this mix of military worlds, and because, of course, Jews were integrated into their units. They were not segregated like African Americans. So, you know, in thinking about the experience of Jews in the American military, you go at it slightly differently from how I went at it. Do you want to say a little bit about how'd you learn about the men? And you also have a woman in there, right? If I
recall. I'm Martha Gellhorn.
You're writing about, yeah.
So I came to it sort of the same way you did, though, which was my grandfather, Abraham Klein, served with Patton's Army in the medical corps, and all my great uncles served. But I grew up, you know, at this place called Three Arrows, which is like a Bundist socialist community in upstate New York. We spent all of our summers there. Everyone is like super left-wing socialist. But man, my grandmother, Irene Klein, if you ever said a bad word about America, you know, potch, that's not going to happen. And I always thought that was really interesting. And that was also another reason I originally wrote Young Lions, was I was so curious about how she held both stances at once, this incredible sense of patriotic connection to the United States, along with this sense that we should challenge it at the same time. And I always thought that was really interesting. Am I echoing at your end? Oh, okay, I was echoing for a second. So the other thing I wanted to do when I wrote this book was sort of try and figure out that generation of Jews the same way that you were. Like, what was it about their experience that they understood as making them American? And so for me, because at that point I primarily wrote literary history, the way I did it was use the opening of novels to get at the story. Like you talk about, like pluralism became a really central way that I think these men wrote about the war. And also this awareness, and you write about this as well, and I got this sort of from your book initially, that when all of these guys were taken from like Jersey and New York and went to do their training in the Deep South, they had their first confrontation with racism. Yeah. And in New Jersey, they also had confrontations with racism in the training there, and segregation. So what I was interested in as well was how their own experiences in the war, like how did Norman Mailer write about in letters his experience in basic training, and then how did it translate into how he decided to write about it in The Naked and the Dead. And so one example was that when he was in training, he talked a lot in his letters about this one Jewish guy who was with them who got a lot of anti-Semitic flack in the training by one of the sort of officers there, and he transforms this in the book. He kind of keeps the exact same story from training and makes it a center turning piece of the novel about these two Jewish guys who deal with anti-Semitism based on his experience is in his own basic training. And also when he was sent to Texas to do his training, he was overwhelmed by the masculinity of these Americans he was encountering. He'd never seen tough guys like this, and he was in awe. And he wrote about that in the letter. So I was also really interested in how their experiences and how their sense of being in this broader America in service translated to how they would rewrite it in their novels. And then the third step, of course, being how would the American public read this? And what would they see? Why would these books be so insanely popular? What was it about the Jewish standpoint that would make that happen? And so, go ahead.
No. I was just going to interrupt about the issue of masculinity, because I used interviews and not just written sources. And a number of the men whom I interviewed talked about the different understanding of masculinity that they experience. So one guy, for example, from the Bronx was really good at sports, and that was key to his masculinity. He played an aggressive, baseball game. That's how you did it. And he goes down to basic training in the South, and they have this baseball game. And the guys are saying, hey, what are you doing? Come, this is just a game. But all of them could drive cars, which of course he couldn't do growing up in the Bronx. And a car was not a connection to being masculine. So, there are really different understandings of masculinity that Jewish Geos have to negotiate. I also use letters like you did, but letters are tricky because it depends on to whom somebody is writing. If they're writing to their wife, it's different. They're more honest. If they're writing to their parents, there's a lot.
That's really interesting, because I was thinking again about Norman Mailer and his letters, and so he writes The Naked and the Dead, which is all about being a Jewish soldier. And so I talk about that. And then after the war, I remember in an interview, he's asked, did you experience any anti-Semitism in service or in basic training? He said, no. But I had these letters where he was talking, oh my God, you wouldn't believe the stuff that I went through. So they completely, all of them, I write about Herman Wouk and Erwin Shaw and Martha Gellhorn and, Joseph Heller, they all sort of reinvented everything after the war. You're absolutely right. And there's a paper trail, fortunately, for a number of them. So I could sort of see what they were reinventing and why they were going there.
So one of the things that they reinvent also is whether they knew about the Holocaust.
Yeah.
I interviewed a flyer, a guy named Sam Klausner, who was stationed in England in 1944 and flying over Germany. And he describes at one point flying over a German town and being given permission. He was a navigator by the bombardier to drop the bomb. The bomb was supposed to hit some rail facilities and factories and stuff, and he dropped it on the town itself. And I remember asking him, did you know about the murder of European Jews? What was going on in the camps? And he said, no, we didn't know about it. And then he gave me his letters. And he writes a Rosh Hashanah letter home to his folks saying, this is 1944, saying, there's one less town in Germany. I dropped the bomb over it, and it was just small payback for the 5 million who were killed. Now, why did the post-war attitude say we didn't know about the Holocaust, when clearly a whole bunch of these guys certainly knew about the Holocaust? It was part of their motivation for fighting. Why did Mailer in an interview decide to erase anti-Semitism when it was? It's a really interesting question.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So in 1948, right, there's six novels by and about Jewish soldiers in World War II that are bestsellers. 6 of them. 2 of them are set in the Pacific. One of them, of course, being The Naked and the Dead. 4 of them are set in Europe. All 4 of those that are set in Europe, how do they end? With the soldiers liberating Dachau concentration camp, or in an unnamed concentration camp. So I mean, part of what I argue in the book is this idea that American Jews didn't talk about the Holocaust. It's not true. They were talking about it in 1948 in these novels in the most explicit terms. I mean, Martha Gellhorn's book, Point of No Return, because she actually was a journalist who was there at the liberation. But it's that old story that we have about, like, everyone was at the liberation of the concentration camps. Well, all the American novels were there. So I think it depended on their sort of post-war stance, but when they were writing about it immediately after the war, particularly those setting their novels like Young Lions by Erwin Shaw in Europe, they went out of their way to make sure that this was relevant to the narrative that they were creating.
Yeah. So I know you've continued to do research on World War II. I have not, although I did participate in a documentary called jMUSE that was based on the book that came out a couple of years ago, which I was very pleased to do. But you do have a new book out, right, about the war?
Yeah. So can I just say about GIG, something about that? So I had thought after the Young Lions, I was going to write a book about Mad Magazine. And then I went to the Center for Jewish History to watch the premiere of GIG. And I remember getting on the subway, and we had just moved back to New York for me to take up this position at Hunter. And I sat on the subway train after watching GIG, and I thought, Leah, you don't get to write about Mad Magazine. You have to stay with World War II. I just knew after that documentary, I got to do another book on this stuff. So can I just briefly tell you about my current work? Because it's taught me a lot about the American Jewish experience too. And I can talk about that later if you want. So my new book is called X-Troop, The Secret Jewish Commandos of World War II, which came out here with HarperCollins, but in the UK with a different title with Penguin. So it was meant for a mass market. And what I tell is the story that in 1942, Churchill and Mountbatten decided to create a secret commando unit of German speakers without really thinking that all the German speakers who are going to want to go fight the Nazis are going to be Jews. So they created this top secret commando unit of German speakers called X-Troop, and it was entirely comprised of Jewish young men from Austria and Germany, most who had come over to the UK on the Kinder transport or on transit visas. When they arrived in the UK, a story that a lot of Americans don't know, which was that Churchill decided that there would be they would intern Germans who were high risk, which meant young men, again, 85% Jewish. So these guys all get interned either in the UK or in Australia or in Canada, have a terrible experience, are finally selected for this commando unit. And once they're being trained, the British military realizes that these men are extraordinary because the war is personal for these men. So talking about the Holocaust, they all need to kill and capture Germans and Nazis because their sisters are hiding and they got to get this war over with to go rescue their family. So when the war breaks out, they're so valuable that the British Army decides to put them in 2s and 3s and 4s with existing commando units to make them the absolute tip of the spear for the Allied invasion. So they're absolutely crucial to the war. And just 2 more points about them. One is they're trained as commandos and in counterintelligence. So unlike the Ritchie boys in America who are just counterintelligence, these guys are commandos to capture the guy and then to interrogate them in the heat of battle to make decisions right then and there. The other aspect about them is, which is part of this extraordinary story of the X-Troop, and I think why the book got crazy amounts of press in the UK was because all of them had to pretend to be British. So they were given about 5 minutes to have fake British names, fake British backstories, Church of England dog tags. I wrote an editorial a couple of days ago where because of the book, we just had one of the X-Troopers moved from a cross to Star of David in a Manchester cemetery. So their Jewishness was completely wiped out. And then the crazy part about the story is they're at the forefront of the denazification campaigns. They're capturing Nazis. They're getting evidence.
That's true for Americans as well.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, yeah.
So but these guys, so after the war, they almost to a man keep their British names, keep their British identities. Those who stay in the UK continue to act, as one of their kids said, more British than the British. And I interviewed commandos to write the book and all this archival material. But those who come to America, and that's why I found this story very interesting for what we're discussing today, they reclaim their Jewishness. They talk about their stories of the Holocaust. And it was such a huge difference between the two populations of these Jewish commandos, what they did, that it taught me all these new lessons about Jewish service in World War II when you looked at the British experience versus the American experience, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think, the service that more than 500,000 American Jews, experienced during World War II really did change their perception of what it meant to be both a Jewish man and an American Jewish man. And it changed also the perceptions of other Americans, of Jews, and indeed of Judaism. So the experience of being in the military, I mean, one of the things I always stress when I'm teaching this subject is that the military teaches you how to fight. And all of these Jewish GIs learned how to fight. And when they came back, they were not going to take stuff that they had accepted from before. You look at the 1930s and how unbelievably anti-Semitic the environment was and how American Jews sort of worked around it. Okay, you can't There are whole industries you can't get jobs in. There are whole places you can't live. There's right. Come back after the war, and it's like, no, we're not going to take this anymore, right? We're going to work to dismantle all of this discrimination that exists in education, that exists in residential, it exists in occupations, etc. I think that's really a crucial experience. What do you see in terms of how the experience of military service changed Jews' perceptions of what it means to be, especially an American Jew?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm going to talk about it by contrasting it with the British experience, because I find I learn things more by comparison. And the British Jewish experience, so these commanders of X-Troop, like I said, very few of them tell their kids they're Jewish. They remain British. They keep the names. They practice Church of England. These are all Holocaust survivors, right? All of these guys. And they were the secret weapon that I 100% believe made the British win the war. But even though they win the war from 1945 to 1947, they're not naturalized. They stay stateless for 2 years, this entire troop. Britain naturalizes the Polish troop and the French troop, not this troop. So it's a dark story of their British experience. So after the war, the situation is so different for British and American Jews. I mean, and I was thinking about the larger story. In the United States, right, we have a very small population that actually serves, like less than 10%, versus in the UK, more than double that are serving in the war. In the UK, the battles are happening on the streets of London during the Blitz. It's very immediate. The country's being racked by war. It's an intimate, universal experience. Here, what it is with our soldiers is they're sent over there, then they come back here, this very small number, very few who actually fight on the front lines, but they become the archetype, like you said, of heroism and toughness and fighting back. That doesn't happen in the UK. Here we get like 3 secretaries of states who were generals. We get Eisenhower as our president after the war. So there's this idea of sort of the military man as this archetype of like heroism that exists a bit in the UK, but there it's just much more the common story. Everyone's like, it doesn't have that kind of exoticness to it that it does here. So my feeling is that American Jews, particularly those who were in the war, like Mailer and Heller and Wook and Irwin Shaw, were able to come back here and write their experiences, become sort of the storytellers for this experience, because the role of the Jew and the soldier was so different here than it was in the UK. There we don't have any Jewish writers writing about war. We don't have any of that stuff. It's a much more, and there we have this sense of anti-Semitism is still very real, which is here we know there was a precipitous drop after the war as well. So the experiences are profoundly different. I mean, there what I found is this idea of hiding oneself after the war, versus here, these Jewish writers could become sort of the spokesperson for what the war meant. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and not just Jewish writers. I mean, just regular guys, because among American Jews, half of Jews eligible to serve served. I mean, it's a huge percentage. This, over 500,000 Jews in the military, and no, of course, not all of them are on the front lines because they serve in all the different branches of the service. But a lot of them are in the infantry as well as in naval forces and as in the Air Corps, etc. I mean, I think one of the things, and you mentioned Eisenhower becoming president. One of the things that he brings and affects American Jews in a way that certainly doesn't affect British Jews is he brings this notion of the Judeo-Christian tradition. I mean, this is what the military worked really hard to do. They didn't want Protestants and Catholics and Jews, being at each other. They wanted to try to create the sense of connect. When you are in fighting in the front, you have to be sure that you can trust the guys behind you, right? And that's crucial. So the notion of a Judeo-Christian tradition is something that gets elaborated in the military. It's elaborated in the chapels that are built that have no insignia on them, just everything is movable. It's elaborated in the dog tags, right? You have P and for Protestant, C for Catholic, and H for Hebrew. It's elaborated in these ceremonies when men are buried, memorial ceremonies. They almost always try to have Protestant, Catholic, Jew together there. So they're creating a mode of American democratic religion, which really expands in the 1950s, and in part because Eisenhower, this was just how you did it, right?
I totally agree. It's so American. It's so uniquely American.
Yeah. So
I want something to that too. Can I add something to that as well?
Sure. Yeah.
But like also what it did for these Jewish servicemen, like you write about, training, and they're encountering, Jim Crow laws and all the stuff that is sort of new to them and they haven't experienced before, because as you write about, most of them come from like these Jewish enclaves. So this is this whole worldly, but they're also experiencing pluralism within limits, right? So as you write about and I write about as well, that this was like a real introduction to racism too for many of them, which of course, it's desegregated in 1948, but many of them who go and serve are very much aware that their group is going to be Italian Americans and Irish Americans and Latinos, but it's not going to include African Americans. These Jewish guys, I think it really sets in their brain from their service this awareness of this difference. And I do think, and I know you've written about this, this is a hugely crucial reason why Jews are so important in the civil rights movement, because of their experiences in the war.
Yeah, I think that their experiences in the war really do shape their involvement in the civil rights movement. And, one of the things we started with your observation about the way in which Holocaust and World War II come together. And I sort of thought maybe we should return to that. How does focusing on Jews in the military, do you think, change how we think about Jewish responses to Nazism and the Holocaust? I mean, the standard historiography for quite a while was that American Jews didn't do anything, right? I mean, 500,000 Jews, fighting the Nazis didn't count in some way. But okay, so we're hopefully beyond that. And if we want to look at it in a more textured way, how do you think that looking at Jews in military service and what happens afterwards, how does that change how we think about American Jews' responses to the Holocaust and Nazism?
That's a really good question. That's a really hard question. I was thinking again of the X-Troop, right? Who, for all of these guys, they're Holocaust survivors. So they're like the archetype of the Holocaust and World War II coming together, these Jewish commandos. But really importantly, as I wrote a lot in my book, the war is completely personal for them. It is personal. The clock is ticking because of the Jews of Europe. And after the war, well, there was always this sort of sense with Jewish communities, I think because of anti-Semitism, we can't say that things are personal. We can't say that we're going to fight World War II because personally we are obsessively worried about our great aunt who's in Poland, and we want to get this war over with to liberate them. I think that was sort of a lot of the sense of American Jewish servicemen. We're just like you guys. We're fighting the same war.
Oh, no. I mean, that's different, Leah.
No, I mean, but like publicly, there was a sense of comradeship here.
Oh.
Yeah. These British guys, they weren't going to talk about how deeply personal the war was for them when they're serving over there. And I think there was a sense here of this. That's how I see it, is this moment of the fighter landing in Europe. And even one of the questions we have is, how does it compare with the Pacific experience? Even when those Jews were fighting in the Pacific, and Deborah, you've written about this more than I have, but I've written about it in terms of the novel, they were always very cognizant that this war, was being fought on two campaigns, but they potentially had brethren in Europe who were experiences this firsthand and profoundly. So it was this larger sort of narrative of World War II, but the sense of this personal double identity, I think, was at the front. But what do you think?
So I'm going to disagree a little bit, because I do think that there's no question that most Americans went to war to fight the Japanese, right? Because Japan had bombed the United States, right? Pearl Harbor.
Right.
American Jews go to war to fight the Nazis.
No, that's what I'm saying. I completely agree with you. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That it was this personal
okay.
thing. Yeah.
But it's not just personal, it's also political.
Yeah.
There's a political sense that these are real enemies of Nazism and Nazis are real enemies of the United States, not just of Jews. And American Jews expand that so that their understanding, I think, is that they're fighting really in a double or triple way, right? They're fighting an American battle. They're also fighting a Jewish battle, understood collectively, not only personally, right? And they're fighting the personal piece. I would say is they're fighting a battle to gain the respect of their fellow soldiers for them as an individual Jew. Right.
Yeah, and even to add to that, when you're talking about sort of back to the Pacific campaign, I was thinking one of the two novels I write about goes out of its way in the novel to talk about, there's this mention in the novel, something like Jewish Americans deal with the same type of country club anti-Semitism that Japanese Americans deal with at the same type as Jews. And that novel goes out of its way to talk about, as do the novels set in Europe, the Nazi as the absolute evil boogeyman, and that trying to convince American readers that they have it wrong, that their obsessive sort of hatred of the Japanese is not where they should be directing it. So all of the American Jewish writers who write the World War II novels go to the absolute limits to teach their readers that the American propaganda may be saying it's about the Japanese, but you guys really, you American readers out there, you need to know where the real evil was. And it was with the Germans who, as we know, American propaganda often sort of talked about our brethren in Europe, including the Germans. And these Jewish writers were saying they're not our brethren in Europe. They are pure evil, and you're misdirecting it towards the Japanese.
Yeah, I think, it makes one think a bit about the legacies of this generation of Jews who served in World War II. And one of the most powerful legacies that I cite, and it's also mentioned in the movie, is the sermon by Roland Gittleson in Iwo Jima. And, this is a sermon that was supposed to be given from one of these joint memorial services, and the Catholic padres objected. So the Protestant chief, chaplain said, okay, we'll do separate ones. But he read the same sermon. And, in that, he says that, we have buried here Black and white, officers and men, people who were very recent immigrants and those whose ancestors came over ages ago. And they represent democracy. And if we don't follow through and create that as a living democracy without those distinctions between men, then we will have betrayed them. And that's, I think, a very powerful legacy that comes out of the war, this sense on the part of Jewish men that the vision of democracy is one of equality, that breaks down the barriers between Black and white officers and men, recent immigrant and old-time Americans.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly sort of what it was with my grandmother Irene Klein, where she could sort of straddle both perceptions of America. I flew to Houston a couple of days ago to give a talk for Veterans Day with a bunch of Jewish veteran groups. And so I met all these Jewish veterans from World War II and from Vietnam. They're still around, and from the Korean War. And they just absolutely personified that sort of doubleness or singleness. I don't know what it is. This intense pride in America for two reasons. One, for having served and fought for this ideal, but two, and I think this is really important too, for having been allowed to serve and fight for this ideal, to have been sort of welcomed, unlike
Right.
British Jews, welcomed into the family, given the gun, and told, go boys, you go help right the world. So it was sort of this double. And when I met with them on Thursday, it was this sense that reminded me deeply of that generation, of gratitude for serving, and also a sense that they were part of this broader American narrative, 100%.
Right, right. And I think that this is one of the things this does is it challenges sort of the Israeli claim, where notions of tough Jews is connected with the Israeli military. Aside from erasing the fact that, American Jews actually went to Palestine to help build up the military, especially the Air Corps there. I'm sort of looking at the clock and thinking we should do a wrap up if we're going to have a couple of questions. Yes, does that say?
Yeah, because we do have a bunch of questions.
So
we do have questions that have come in. So when you're ready, I'll be happy to pose those.
Okay, great.
Go ahead.
You can start with the questions, or we can have one last sentence, which is, do you want to indicate what you see as the implications of hundreds of thousands of Jewish men in military service? I would say, from my point of view, that what it does is it reminds us that military service became the common experience of Jewish men for several decades, starting in World War II, up through Korea, up until Vietnam.
I agree. Yeah, and also helped Jews reinvent what it meant to be a Jewish American male. And just also because of my work on X-Troop and my work on Jewish American servicemen in World War II, something more practical, I fully believe that we beat the Nazis because we had all these Jewish soldiers, 100%, and in the Russian army too. So I think there was a real practical impact of this as well.
Okay, questions?
So first question, how do you compare the experience and past war self-understanding of American Jews who served in the European versus Pacific theaters?
Okay, so that's a great question. The service in the European theaters was far more dangerous for Jewish GIs, and they were well aware of it because they faced the possibility of capture. And with the possibility of capture came the possibility of them not being treated as POWs, but instead being treated as Jews. So there are many Jews who were captured and who threw away their dog tags. The film GI Jews has a wonderful brief discussion of one master sergeant, who wasn't Jewish, who refused in a POW camp to turn over the Jewish soldiers that the SS had demanded. So that type of danger is not present in the Pacific, and that's really important difference between the European and the Pacific theater. And the Pacific theater, the kind of fighting that occurred, from island to island, is also somewhat different from what existed in Europe. It was a situation where Jews were very much integrated and part of these units as they moved through battling the Japanese. When they suffered, as they did, in the Bataan Death March, there was no singling out of Jews at all, and that's a big difference.
So a bit of a statement and a question combined. Everything you have described sounds very similar to what I found in my master's research on Japanese American identity in World War II. Have you found these themes, stereotypes impacting writing, racism in Southern military camps, et cetera, prevalent across many groups in World War II?
You want to take that?
So I've only read about the novelists, and so my scope is very limited, and all of them, of course, went through basic training. all of them discussed it to a man, talked about the sense of realize. And like I said, even in New Jersey, Norman Mailer talked about being aware of this segregation when he was in New Jersey briefly during basic training. So all of them discussed it. All of them were shocked by it, and all of them felt in the novels that it made them reconsider what it meant to be Jewish, because they didn't know that there was this other America. They hadn't had contact with it so intimately before. So for the novelists amongst them, they made this a forefront of all of their narratives, regardless if they were in the Pacific or were in the European campaign.
I would add,
yeah,
I would add that for Mexican Americans, especially, it was a very similar experience. The prejudice that they faced, the need to prove themselves, but also this very strong identification with wanting to fight for Americans, for the United States, I should say. Yeah.
We have another question here. Would you comment on the issuing of the 4 chaplains stamp during the war?
Actually, the stamp doesn't come out until after the war, but the 4 chaplains is really a wonderful story. And it is this vision of these 4 men, 2 Protestants, 1 liturgical, 1 evangelical, a Catholic and a Jew, who make the decision on the Dorchester ship, which was a troop ship in the North Atlantic that was torpedoed, to give away their life-saving gear to other men and to go down together with the ship. And that vision of these 4 men linking arms, speaking 3 different languages, praying in English if you're Protestant, in Latin if you're Catholic, and in Hebrew if you're Jewish, going down together as Americans, was a very, very powerful image that spoke to this religion of democracy, made up of Protestants, Catholics, and Jews.
And that shows up in 2 of the post-war novels as well. It shows up.
Yeah.
So apologies for not giving you a proper introduction at the start of this panel, but thank you for diving in there. I want to thank Deborah Dash Moore and Leah Garrett for a fascinating conversation. And you can learn more about them in their biographies on the lobby homepage. And we are going to conclude this session and move on into the next session. So thank you so much, Deborah. Thank you so much, Leah.
Thank you so much for having us.
Appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.